Bum, 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 ba-da-da-da-da-da, ba-ba-ba. Hello interwebs and welcome to my channel and my latest review of Star Trek Discovery Season 2 Episode 6? The Sounds of Thunder. So this episode gave us a whole bunch of Saru backstory and explored Saru's planet and character and finally gave us a lot of answers that were set up and also the short trek that Saru featured in this past fall. So let me give you my overall general thoughts of the episode before we dive into the recap. I really liked this episode. I thought it was a very strong episode of Star Trek Discovery. Some really great moments for Doug Jones, Saru in this episode. Also gave us a couple hints and a couple good moments between Culber and Stamets as well, though that plot thread kind of got sort of forgotten about part of the way through the episode, which was a bit disappointing, but I'm sure it'll be picked up in future episodes. That being said, while I did like a lot of the stuff in this episode, there were a couple things that sort of keep me from being like, this was great, amazing, top tier Trek. It is definitely a very strong episode of Discovery, but I don't think it really just barely doesn't pass that threshold of becoming great. Just for a couple issues that I think knock it down. And it gave us a lot of moral questions and a lot of ethical questions to really debate about and a lot of good discussions to think about going forward, which is what really a good Trek episode should do. It should leave you with a guiding star, as it were, in the direction of what the answers actually are to this situation, to these sort of moral and ethical dilemmas, but not give you everything right up front and really sort of let you sit and think about it and tease it out in your brain. Basically acting as a primer for discussion. And I think this episode really, really does that well. And like I said, there's just a couple things that really, not so much that I think they were done badly, I just think they could have really kind of delved into a little bit more and gave me a little bit more, particularly on the Baul, just to sort of make things feel more well-rounded. And so we got sort of a larger picture of all the sides of the debate going on. Before we delve into the actual recap of the episode, I just want to make a quick little caveat from my last episode review. I sort of had this issue last episode with how everyone kind of knew about Section 31 and that it seemed kind of like an open secret. Previously, we had seen Section 31 as being its own separate organization, both in Deep Space Nine as well as in Star Trek Enterprise, which take place both before and after Discovery. So the question sort of came up of like, well, if it was secret before and after Discovery, why are they out during Discovery's time period? So I want to take back my sort of critique of that last episode because there apparently was an interview with Alex Kurtzman that said this season, or at least future seasons as we delve into the Section 31 story, will reveal why they sort of went into hiding by Deep Space Nine's time. So I can kind of buy that for right now. I reserve judgment on how that story is going to go into the future and how that's going to develop. I'm not a huge canon freak, so I'm totally down with sort of evolving it and seeing where this story goes. All right, so let's now dive into the recap of the episode. I loved this opening monologue that Saru had where he talks about we carry our pasts and our homes with us wherever we go. Sort of a great way to sort of start off the episode, and also a really great visual transition there. We go from Kaminar into Saru's quarters, and we sort of see how Saru still carries that with him. 2 episodes ago, when we first saw Saru's quarters, we sort of got this idea that he carried Kaminar with him, and I like sort of that they still didn't like beat you over the head with it here, didn't state like this is why he does it, but they sort of let you visually understand that. Just great visual cutting in that scene. Just the opening montage was just very, very strong visually, I think, overall. And a couple really good long takes in this opening as well. We sort of have a long take where Saru and Culber sort of have this nice connection moment, and then it sort of moves into Saru talking with the doctor about his sort of new physiology and how it's repressing his fear. I always like long takes, not just because of like, oh, look at the technical stuff, but because I think it allows the actors to really sit in the scene longer and really feel the scene. Opposed to like cutting where you kind of aware like, oh, they're messing with different takes and things like that. You really kind of get to sit with the actors. So I kind of like that we got a couple of those this episode. And we got another one later on when Saru sort of enters the turbolift and makes the decision to beam down to Kaminar and surrender himself. I will say that scene between Saru and Culber was really, really strong. Both actors are just so great. I mean, there's so many great actors in the show, but Wilson Cruz is really nailing Culber feeling distant and sort of out of himself. We could really feel that he really wasn't quite there. In any of his scenes, that he just had this distance view from the world. It's very PTSD-like, sort of disassociating from a lot of things. He sold that really, really well. You could really feel that in him. So very strong. And I like Saru sort of being very empathetic. He always is, and sort of reaching out and trying to be like, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe you're becoming more of who you are supposed to be. I also liked the question that Saru asked, what is a Kelpien without fear? And I really liked that line, and this whole episode in general really hit me as a queer person. because as a queer person, we live in an age where being queer and trans and all these things are really, it's not really all that great to be a trans person in America right now. And certainly there are other identities and groups that actually have it worse than I do as a white upper middle class trans person, not to get into identity politics too much. It just spoke to me because a lot of my life is defined by this sort of fear and worry, and not just sort of because of the world, but my internalized self. And so I like this sort of idea that Saru's grappling with this whole episode of like, what am I now that I'm evolved and become this sort of next step? As a trans person, that really speaks to me very obviously. It's like I've come out, I've transitioned, I've done all these things that I've wanted to do, and what does it mean for me to be a trans person who is post-transition? There's so many great little ties into there that I really, as a queer person, I could feel, and I'm sure many other identities and people could feel that way as well. Not just on an identity level, but I'm sure, you know, anyone for your life or how things are going and, you know, your situation right now, you could also feel that way. So just very strong ideas in this episode. There was the scene where we had Pike, Ash, and Burnham sort of talking about the Red Angels, and Ash sort of being like, I don't really trust them, they could be dangerous sort of thing. Very Section 31-y. I kind of like that. I like that idea of him sort of being like maybe they're evil, but that scene just too cutty. I don't mind having a spinning camera, but it just kept cutting and changing directions, and I kind of got a little bit like, ugh. I'm not usually someone who feels the cuts too much. I'm an editor. That's how I make my money. So it's weird for me to kind of feel like there's too much going on. That scene, editing-wise and visually, just didn't work as well for me. A great little beat where Pike comes out and Saru doesn't give up his chair. Nice little moment how Saru doesn't even think about it. It sort of ties into Saru's character building about how he doesn't have fear anymore. He would normally probably have been aware that Pike would have wanted his seat, but Saru is now sort of becoming more distant. And I'm curious to see that evolve even further throughout the show. Is Saru going to become less empathetic because now he has no fear and now he can't relate as well? But it'll be an interesting question to see how they explore that. So then we learn that Saru's home planet, Kaminar, has a red burst around it. So the Starship Discovery goes in to investigate. So after the opening credits, we got some answers a little bit more about the Baul, because after the short track earlier this year about Saru's home planet, it was kind of confusing. We had learned that Saru was a prey species, but they just kind of were called, and we didn't really know how it worked and all these sort of the great balance and these ideas. So we got a little bit more stated for us, which was very helpful. The Baul are a warp-capable species that call the Kelpians to keep this great balance, and they sort of manipulated the Kelpians into worshipping them as gods and sort of submit to getting themselves killed by the Baul. Now, I thought there was going to be some sort of twist that like the Baul were the Kelpians, like the evolved Kelpians, but I'm glad it didn't go that way because it felt a bit obvious. As they got to Kaminar, we had this great standoff between Saru and Pike. It was really great. It sort of had a lot of dynamics going on in there, with Saru sort of being rightfully angry that his species was basically being genocided slowly, or at least being culled. But Pike also understandably being like, you are too close to this, I can't have you involved. But also knowing that he was the one that was most qualified to talk to anybody because he's the one that knew the most information. And we also learned that messing with the Kelpians is a judgment call whether it fits General Order 1, because they've already had a interaction with a warp-capable species, the Baul, which was interesting to me. And it sort of raises a question, and this is sort of one of my main issues with the whole episode, and I'll get more into it later, is this sort of idea that General Order 1, whether Starfleet has a right to interfere. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit down the road because it's going to be more direct for a different part of the episode. We also get a scene, the last scene between Stamets and Wilson Cruz and Culber, down in the medical bay, where we learn that Culber is pristine, no sexual innuendo intended, but he is perfect and he's sort of lost his scar. I like that's how that scene played out. Stamets playing the sort of very braggy boyfriend and lover and sort of like talking him up and being like, oh, I know these stories about you. It's very similar dynamic to what I have with my girlfriend, sort of like one who's like, I like to brag about my girlfriend and sort of tell her stories. But it also meant that he was missing that Culber was very dissociated from the whole situation, and that something's going on with him. He's not fully there. He doesn't fully feel like himself. It's sort of a repeated motif in this episode and also the Discovery series in general, of characters sort of feeling like they don't quite fit in their body and in their identity. We've had that with Saru this episode. We had that with Ash Tyler. We're going to have that with Burnham, of being sort of a Vulcan and human heritage. Just a lot of characters feeling this sort of tug of war within their own internalized identities, which is something that goes back to the beginning of Treks with Spock, but just a noted motif in this series. So we had a touching scene between Burnham, Saru, and Saru's sister, Sarana, where Saru gets to have sort of his reunion moment. It was very cute and felt very appropriate that she was sort of welcome him back and be like, oh my gosh, I missed you, I loved you, I thought you were dead. And then Saru just sort of kind of laying it on thick, being like, hey, there's a galaxy full of species and all these things, and, credit to Sarana, she takes it in stride and was like, yeah, cool, I accept this. But also sort of ties in sort of the empathy idea of her species, about she sort of understands and accepts Burnham instantaneously, even though she sort of has this fear receptors. Sort of good character building across the species there. I really kind of liked that. And I like the scene immediately after where we sort of see that Sarana does have some anger towards Saru, rightfully so, for him abandoning her. And yes, it was the right choice for Saru to leave. He needed to go and find himself and also sort of get out of that really terrible situation of the Baul culling his species, and that he couldn't really do anything about it, but he made the right choice. But Sarana also having a rightful anger that he never came back, never fought back. We can see both sides of that argument, and I really liked that it wasn't just no one was totally right or totally wrong in that situation, which again is sort of a theme for the whole episode. The Baul start attacking the Discovery, and Burnham and Saru come back up to the ship. Both the name Baul and the Baul ships, and sort of this whole situation of like these people being sort of forced to worship a greater technologically advanced species as gods, reminded me a lot of like Stargate. Like their ship designs had a very pyramid design. Their name comes from like sort of Egyptian ideals, and that sort of setup of like, how the Goa'uld in Stargate made people worship them as gods. It's sort of a very surface level comparison, but just made me think of it. Thought it was cool. Saru sort of stands up to the Baul and says, no, fuck you guys for calling us. And I like the Baul had this really kind of creepy, disturbing voice. Like that voice on the bridge was just super creepy. And again, sort of this great sort of push and pull between Saru, Pike, and the Baul here, where Saru is right to yell at the Baul, but it's also sort of right for Pike to be like, look, our job is not to come in here and piss off these people and sort of do whatever we want. But also when Pike sort of realizes like, no, I need to take the moral stand and protect my crew member, he stands up and does that. He does the right thing. Pike is just such a well-done leader. And I also liked the scene earlier, I didn't mention it, but I also liked how when Saru says, I will always put Discovery's mission first, Pike says, never doubted it. Pike is like the perfect leader. He's everything a leader should be. He challenges people, he stands up to his people when they need to be stood up to, but he also knows when to accept when he's wrong, and he also knows when to change his direction and listen to his crew members. He's just, overall, just a very, very excellent captain. I think probably one of the best captains that we've seen on the show, even better than Picard in some aspects. Not saying he's a greater or more iconic captain than Picard, but I think a lot of his leadership aspects are actually a lot stronger and more developed than Picard. I know, RIP comment section, I know someone's gonna yell at me for that. Saru gets kicked off the bridge, and we have this wonderful, again, long take in the turbo lift where we sort of see Doug Jones and Saru make the decision to give himself up. And I mentioned that sort of before. Saru gives himself up despite Burnham trying to stop him, and then Saru gets beamed over to a Baul ship. Back on the Discovery, Burnham discovers from the probe from a few episodes ago that actually what happened was Saru's species was a predator species. Post-Vahari Kelpians are actually predators of the Baul. So the Baul were almost hunted to extinction, and then they sort of turned the tide when they sort of advanced more technologically and managed to put this into this state that they're at right now, the Great Balance, where they stopped the Kelpians from becoming predators, but also started culling them. And we sort of see that play out on the Baul ship, where the creepy, and I liked the design for the Baul, that sort of comes out of the water, and we learn that they're sort of underwater creatures, and they're sort of creepy and dark. Comes out and basically says, you'll never learn, you'll always kill us, you can't, control yourself. I didn't like how the Baul were kind of very talky and didn't really do much. They kind of he just kind of stood there, looked creepy, and then went away. And I think this is my major problem with the episode overall. I liked some of the interesting moral questions that this episode brought up. That obviously it wasn't right for Saru's species to basically almost genocide the Baul, but it wasn't right for the Baul to do the same thing sort of in return. And yes, it might be more merciful to at least let them live their lives, quote unquote merciful, but still a sort of two wrongs don't make a right. I really like that idea, and conceptually it's just a really cool sort of concept to explore here in this episode. But where I think it mildly falls apart, and it's by no means badly done, and I think that all that is there, I just wish we got a little bit more of the Baul side of things, separate from the sort of creepiness and sort of mystery surrounding them. Because we only got two real scenes where we get their point of view. The one on the bridge with their voice, and then the one where he's sort of the creepy water monster talking at Saru. And the one on the bridge was cool and creepy and an interesting setup, but it really was still trying to perpetuate this mystery of like what's really going on. So it's like still speaking in code of like, you don't know what you are, Saru. But then on the ship, we do get this sort of Baul point of view of basically saying like, you know, you'll never change. You know, we did this to keep the balance, and, you know, obviously sort of postulating this sort of incorrect viewpoint and not trying to build a bridge, but instead trying to put down the Kelpiens to sort of protect themselves. But the Baul, after this point, were sort of just portrayed as one-note villains, just kind of like, obviously they look creepy, they're dark and scary monsters, and then they sort of try to blow up the Discovery and genocide all of the Kelpiens. All terrible decisions, and I almost wish we just got a little bit more, like one more scene with them where they basically say like, no, we'll never trust you, you'll never change, like something like that to sort of like combat this viewpoint. Because after this point, it just felt like Starfleet was just meddling in affairs that they shouldn't meddle in to a degree. Because after this point, Starfleet and Pike sort of decide that we're gonna, you know, evolve all of the Kelpiens, and then the Kelpiens are going to hopefully create a better society with the Baul instead of wanting repercussions or like, I don't know, it just feels like there was more moral ramifications to be decided here that didn't really get taken into account because we just needed to move quickly in the episode. And I get that it was sort of like a necessary like step, and that like the Red Angels were manipulating events and causing this to happen right now, and sort of maybe another test for the Discovery crew, and then the Red Angels showed up and manipulated events so they could stop the genocide and actually create this moment where we get sort of peace among Kelpiens and Baul. But I don't know, it just felt to me that that's a decision that should have been made that quickly by Pike. Pike sort of puts up this, like, gives a couple lines about, like, should we be doing this? And Burnham sort of stating back, it's like, no, this is the right thing to do. But it's like, there's so many factors to play into this. Like, do you really think the Kelpiens are really not at all going to want restitution or be angry at the Baul? And you know that the Kelpiens are capable, not saying that they are going to do this, but they are capable of almost genociding the Baul in their evolved form. And again, I know two wrongs don't make a right, and the Baul shouldn't be killing the Kelpiens, but it's one of those situations where I feel like Starfleet should not have just made that decision for everyone on the Kelpien planet. While Saru was one of their species, I don't know, I just feel like he didn't have the right to make that choice for everyone, and that it should have been something where Starfleet came in and be like, let's negotiate this and like have a peace summit and have a treaty. And I know that's not super exciting, but it's something I feel like, going back to my Pike versus Picard sort of view, I feel like that's something that Picard would have done versus like Pike. But again, you could tie that into the eras. Like, we're in the 23rd century versus the 24th. 23rd century was the era of Kirk and sort of like run and gun, like we're going to lay down our sort of moral values on these planets that we come across. We see that in TOS. Versus like the 24th century, where Picard is someone who's much more like, oh, we'll negotiate, we'll talk, we'll sit things through and sort of have a peace summit and sort of things like that. So we could toss it up to, you know, that's just how people are in the 23rd century, running gun and morality, like sort of shoot from the hip morality going on. I wish we had a little bit more thoughtfulness seen on the Starfleet side of things. But again, I know it's sort of a show and you gotta move quickly, and we can think about it that way. Decide to evolve all the Kelpiens. And then the Red Angels show up to stop the Baul from genociding the entire planet. And then we sort of, Saru gets a good look and gives us our best look at the Red Angels. And we learn that they're humanoids with sort of mechanical wings and mechanical suits on, which is super interesting. Could tie into a lot of different theories, like maybe it's time-traveling humans. Maybe it's time-traveling Spock from the future. Maybe it is the Iconians. A lot of different possibilities that we could see now from that. But again, nothing too set in stone. And then the last two scenes that I really kind of wanted to touch upon were the final two of the episode, where we get Saru kind of saying goodbye to his sister. His sister decides to stay on the planet to sort of bring them into this new era, kind of cliched, but we've seen that before, but really sort of well done and a touching goodbye between the two. And I liked how that sort of easily sort of motivated Burnham to want to go back to Vulcan, to feel like she needed to understand her brother more to be able to move forward. And you can sort of see the parallels between Saru and Sarana and Burnham and Spock. And I kind of liked that sort of setup and that sort of parallel between their characters. And I also really liked the building relationship of Saru and Burnham this season. We saw them becoming kind of like begrudging frenemies in season 1 to sort of this like full-on friendship. Some people have said it's been a bit too fast for them. For me, I kind of really do, I think it works overall as we saw them get from this point, this sort of mutual respect but not really love of each other, to being people who really love each other. And I thought that that sort of arc has really worked and paid off well in their relationship this season. And we also get the scene between Pike and Ash Tyler. Again, sort of reiterating what we knew at the beginning of the episode, where Ash Tyler's basically like, I don't really trust these Red Angels. They have this super big technology. They're maybe time travelers. We don't want to get into a war with them. And Pike sort of being like, they could be good guys, and we don't know yet, and you're sort of making rash judgments. But really sort of building off that PTSD and sort of really kind of showing the ramifications of season 1, that like war has an effect on society, that no matter how high your ideals, that going through something traumatic, both as a society and as an individual person, leaves scars and sort of influence how you think. And Pike's someone who didn't have to go through that war, so of course he's going to be a little bit more trusting than anyone else. And I like that sort of setup in that conflict about how, you know, the trust versus not trust. And it's just sort of an interesting dilemma and sort of an interesting way to show the real scars that season 1 can have, the psychological scars that a war can have. Not just these sort of obvious, like, we lost people, we lost resources and things like that, but the trauma that war and PTSD brings. So really curious to see where that goes. I really kind of like that setup in that scene. Really strong episode. I think there were some really great questions brought up in this episode, but I think we sort of glossed over sort of the Baul's side of things and sort of presumed what their position was all about. And we also sort of glossed over Starfleet's role and whether they did have a right to do that. And honestly, what I would have done is I would have cut out Culber and Stamets stuff. As much as I love Culber and Stamets, I feel like you really could have explained to me that, like, oh, next episode we'll deal with them. It's only been like 2 or 3 days, because this episode only takes place like a day after last episode. And you could have just pushed that into next episode and then really kind of focused this episode on giving a few more scenes to Baul or to Pike or to Starfleet. Let them have a full cohesive episode next episode. And that's sort of my problem with Discovery in general that I'm really finding this season, is that I really think Discovery is a show that really should be binged. I'm curious what everyone else feels about this, but it feels like, you know, there's a lot of frustrations going on, like, oh, they keep delaying Spock. They keep having like scenes pop up in these episodes that don't really get finished off within the episode. We saw that earlier in Point of Light, where there was a lot of sort of plot threads that didn't really tie up at the end, but they just sort of like got dropped halfway through because we know we're going to pick up on them a few episodes down the line. And that really feels to me like a sort of binge-worthy trait of shows, that some shows that are binged don't really feel like they have cohesive episodes, but kind of just go on through episodes kind of blur together. And I don't mean to say that Discovery doesn't have an episodic structure, because it clearly has like different stories for each episode, which is different than some binge shows, but I think it's trying to have it both ways, where it wants to have this sort of binge-worthy structure, but then not giving fully cohesive episodes. There's just storylines that sort of get brought up just to remind you about it, but then don't really feel like they're completed. So I just feel like this sort of halfway point within the series, and it's almost like I just wish you would commit to your episodic structure and do it that way. Not saying I don't want you to have a sort of prolonged story arc throughout the season, but you need to have sort of bigger payoffs or quicker payoffs. That's something that like early seasons of Lost sort of did, and not later seasons of Lost where it strung things out for way too long. Or you just need to make it a binge show and just give us all the episodes at once and just say, here they all are, watch them all the way through. I feel like it's just going to become more and more frustrating as the season goes on, because we're just going to get these sort of little doles out of the story. So I think that's just one of my major criticisms of the season so far. What do you guys think? Comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And please check out the rest of my channel. I do a bunch of Star Trek videos, LGBTQ education videos and other nerd topics as well on my channel. So if you like any of those topics, please consider giving me a subscribe. And until next time, live long and prosper.